listed on the opening slide who joined us to bring this forum to our community. I'm Rabbi Noah Farkas, President and CEO of the Jewish Federation of Greater Los Angeles. We're less than 2 weeks away from a critical election in our city, where we'll decide our new mayor. We're proud to be able to provide this opportunity to all of you to hear directly from the candidates about so many issues facing LA. Our Jewish community is raw, with fear and anger that in 2022, we are suffering from intense anti-Semitism. Seemingly every week, there's a new attack, incident, or outburst of hate speech. And we know that hateful speech leads to hateful actions. We must be vigilant. Our federation is keeping our community safe, monitoring threats, working with law enforcement, and building alliances with civic partners to address this moment. We will not allow our community to be threatened and to feel this level of fear. And we know that the other organizations co-sponsoring this forum tonight are similarly focused on these issues. Los Angeles is a wonderful, multicultural, and diverse city. It is home to the second largest Jewish population in the country and the fourth largest in the world. Our federation is the backbone of the LA Jewish community, and according to our study of Jewish LA, we're the most diverse diaspora in the world. 50% of Jewish Angelenos have immigrants living in their home. Nearly 20% are barely getting by financially. Jewish Angelenos inhabit nearly every corner of this city. We, a diverse Jewish community, are deeply vested in the outcome of this election. We must always remember that there's far more that unites us than divides us, that we are stronger together than we are apart, and we will continue to battle hate with love and our work with communities of all backgrounds to squash this scourge of anti-Semitism and all forms of hate. To our candidates for mayor, our city is about to entrust in you its highest office. We ask you this: how will you use your executive power to address this hate crisis? What pledge will you make to our community on these issues? What are your plans regarding other vital issues such as crime, homelessness, and climate change? And if you win the election, will the Jewish community have a voice in your office? I hope that tonight's forum allows all of you, our listeners, to make an informed decision when you vote in this election. Please get out and vote. Vote by mail, drop off your ballot, or head to the polls on November 8th. It's one of our most sacred rights at one of our most important times. I'd like now to turn over our program to Alex Cohen, our moderator for the evening. Thank you.
Thank you. I genuinely want to thank Rabbi Farkas for those powerful words. Good evening. My name is Alex Cohen, and I host a nightly political public affairs program on Spectrum News 1. It's called Inside the Issues with Alex Cohen. I also host a weekly podcast of the same name with Pomona College's Sarah Sidwani, who is with us here this evening. I'd like to give my sincere thanks to ADL, AJC, and the Jewish Federation of Greater Los Angeles. I am deeply, deeply honored to be here this evening, and I really look forward to a very lively candidate forum, which honestly could not have come at a more important time in our city. In light of the recent horrific anti-Semitic incidents and shocking leaked racist recordings of LA City Council members, the organizations wanted to focus our conversation tonight, this forum, on values as a city, values as a Jewish community. And tonight, we will hear from the two candidates separately about their plans for this city and how we truly chart a path forward. Before we begin, I want to note that ADL Los Angeles, the Jewish Federation of Greater Los Angeles, and the American Jewish Committee Los Angeles are all nonpartisan 501c3 organizations. They do not endorse, nor do they oppose individual candidates, nor support a specific party. They do not take sides in electoral politics, and remarks made here this evening do not reflect the organization's positions. Here's how things are going to work. Tonight, I will be asking each of our candidates questions on 5 separate topics. The candidates will then be asked several questions from our audience here tonight, followed by brief closing remarks. These 2 candidates will not be watching, nor will they be listening to their opponent's portion of the evening. And now, let's get this candidate forum started. I am so pleased to begin here with Congressmember Karen Bass. Thank you for being with us tonight.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, and the Federation and ADL and all the other supporting organizations.
And I'm going to be a multitasker here. We're going to be honest and keep everyone in the same amount of time. Our clock begins here. According to one of our hosts this evening, the ADL, hate crimes against Jewish people have reached a 5-year high in Southern California last year. And as mentioned, this past weekend, we saw evidence of that once again as anti-Semitic banners were unfurled over the 405 freeway. Hateful propaganda showing up throughout all corners of Los Angeles. As Rabbi Farkas so eloquently told the LA Times recently, there are celebrities with more followers than there are Jews living on this planet, and they are spewing their hate. I mean, it's a really insightful thought. So if you are elected, there are already so many campaigns and strategies currently in operation. LA is for everyone, saying that we are against hate. What will you specifically do to combat what is seen as a scary and precipitous rise in anti-Semitism?
Absolutely, and we all know that anti-Semitism is the oldest form of bigotry in the world, in the history of the world. And I was horrified when I woke up and saw what had happened in our city, that somebody would do that. And so I immediately called and denounced it. But also, you know, people have to be held accountable. They have to pay a price. And to me, I called immediately for the contracts to be canceled with Kanye. And Kanye's, behavior is what it is. But the fact that the banner said Kanye was right is a perfect example of how his speech led to that act. It gave license to that act. And so we are seeing a rise in anti-Semitism. And then you mentioned the tapes that we heard in City Council. And there's one thing for me to tell you what I would do as mayor, but I would also like to tell you what I do right now. And so after I heard the tapes on Sunday, we convened a meeting on Tuesday of civic leaders. And it was kind of interesting because the people that showed up reflected every category on that tape, including 2 rabbis, because there was anti-Semitic conversation happening as well. And we spent about an hour talking about what happened, but then we said we have to move into action. And this is something that I have done for years and years, built coalitions around race, class, geography, ideology, in solidarity with each other, because we experience hate crimes. And so we spent about an hour talking about it, and then we said we need to move into action. And we decided to have a series of convenings around the city, talking about what happened, but then also saying, how do we get at the root of this? Because what I have learned over the years in building coalitions is that it's one thing to talk, but really the way you build coalitions and unity is through action and through work. And so we proposed a series of policy topics to take up. Redistricting is one. But what I would also do if I am awarded the privilege of being elected as mayor, we really need to beef up hate crime enforcement, but awareness. Because I think that there needs to be a lot of public education about hate crimes, because we know the ones that come to our attention. What worries me are the ones that don't come to our attention. And one thing that I wonder about what is happening in the Jewish community, specifically with these anti-Semitic flyers and all, they get dropped off at people's houses. I'm just wondering what is happening in the neighborhoods and if there are cameras that neighbors might have. Because the bottom line is we need to find out who's doing it, and they need to be held accountable. And so I want to see what is going on in the neighborhood. Are there cameras? And if not, maybe that's something we should look at, because I don't know every street that it's happened on, but it sure seems to be targeted in certain neighborhoods. Yeah. And I do think there needs to be serious accountability.
And we will talk about things such as the leaked recordings in a moment, but we have a few moments left on this topic. How do you balance the need to protect people from hate with our First Amendment, freedom of speech?
Well, I mean, I think that, again, the perfect example of how speech can lead to action, and when it does, somebody has to be held accountable. Just like the old story that's always told about the First Amendment, if you yell fire in a theater, you have to be held accountable for that. And what I do think was good, though, was that he was held accountable.
Let's move on. And our second topic here tonight is racism, which we were asking about in light of these leaked conversations, which have reminded so many of us that despite our hopes and aspirations, we are still living in a place where there are deep divisions and prejudices do exist. I'm curious what that hateful conversation revealed to you about politics in the city of Los Angeles. And if elected, how do you create a new narrative beyond condemnation?
Well, one, of course, it was particularly hurtful, given that I know the four individuals, and one of the individuals in the room I've known for 40 years, and one I've known for 20. And when you know somebody like that and that's revealed, then that's, particularly particularly hurtful. But I think that it shows the level to which politics can go, meaning a very low level. And it's politics, and it's also power, and it's also resources. And so I think that was particularly egregious to hear how desperate they were to hold on to power. But it also raised the question to me of equity and the distribution of resources in our city. And so one of the things that the civic leaders are going to be looking at is, why is our city so unequal? Why is it that one side of town looks one way, another side of town looks another way? But one thing that I wholeheartedly reject is the idea that that conversation in that room set race relations back years. I've spent decades working on building bridges across race, religion, ideology, and a conversation like that sets us back only if we choose to allow it to set us back, and I refuse to do that. So when things like that happen, you double down and you triple down on your work together, and you make sure that it's on full display, and again, you do hold people accountable. And two people decided to be accountable, and two have not. And I think that that's too bad, because it leaves a wound open. And I would like for that wound to begin to heal. But part of the healing is those two individuals, those two council members, need to step down.
We'd like to hear from you tonight about your own personal experience, your own background, your own identity, things that have happened to you that really shape how you view racial relations in this city.
Well, it was really how I grew up and where I grew up. So I grew up in the 60s listening to or watching the civil rights movement on TV with my father and listening to his stories. But I also grew up in the Jewish community in the Venice-Fairfax area. And the schools I went to, my elementary school was Hancock Park, my high school was Hamilton High. When I went to Hamilton, Hamilton was a Jewish high school. There was a small number of African-American students that were there. And actually, it was the Jewish parents that got me involved in politics. I had a lot of people that, got me interested. But Hamilton High during those years was a very activist high school. Our teachers were activists, the parents were activists, and needless to say, the students were as well. I remember very well the 1967 war, actually. I remember the sound trucks going up and down the street talking about a blow-by-blow account of what was happening. My friends' parents were Holocaust survivors, so I remember the first time I saw a tattoo and what that meant. So those are very powerful experiences that shaped me, but I also remember, too, during the civil rights movement, the alliance between the African American and Jewish community. So I grew up making a commitment at a very young age that I wanted to spend my life fighting for justice, and that is how I spent my life. It sent me many different directions. When I was growing up, that was not a job, so I worked in healthcare until 1990 when I started a nonprofit organization at the height of the violence and drug problem in South Central Los Angeles.
We want to turn now to the topic of representation and governance, because there have been a lot of questions about that raised in the wake of these recordings and the scandal at City Hall. This city has a very unique political structure. I'm curious what you think if anything, works well about the way the politics are structured now, and what, if any, changes you would like to see made when it comes to governance?
Well, I mean, first and foremost, because of everything that's happened, redistricting needs to be independent. There's no question about that. I do think there's a question as to whether the city council should be expanded. And I don't want to see us have a knee-jerk reaction, because that happens oftentimes when you have a crisis, people rush into policy. And I think that we need to examine whether we expand the city council. One of the things I want to look at is the issue of equity, as I mentioned before, because right now the history is and the behavior is it's a pie with 15 slices and everything is divided equally. And I think that is problematic because not all issues are equal. And I do think that that leads to fighting over redistricting and all of that. So how the city distributes resources, how the city provides services is something that I want to look at.
And if you are not successful in your bid to become the next mayor of LA, we're curious, have you given any thought to what you might do next? And could you see yourself playing a role in your opponent's administration if he is elected?
You know, Rick Caruso and I have worked together before. We've known each other for a long time. And to me, I view an election, you know, it's like a sporting event. When it's over, it's over. And you move forward. I'm very devoted to the city, and it was a big decision for me not to run for Congress again. I could have easily run for Congress and run after a leadership position there. I made a strategic decision because that's how deeply concerned I am about what is going on in the city. I have been an activist and fighting for justice my whole life. Nothing is going to change.
Today was another very interesting day at City Hall as we saw the council trying to do their business and a small group of protesters saying that no business should happen until these council members resign. Can you talk a little bit about how you see the balance between, again, freedom of speech, the ability for protesters and the Angelenos to make their voices and their complaints and concerns known, with trying to get the work of the city done?
Well, first of all, I think the work of the city needs to move forward. Regardless, I do think that Kevin De Leon and Gil Cedillo should step down, but if they are not, the work of the city does still need to go on. And I think that it is appropriate, as Council President Krikorian has allowed for, you know, the conversation. I do hope that people kind of get it out of their system and we can get back to work. And then it's up to the residents of De Leon's council district as to whether or not he continues. We know that Gil Cedillo is out in a few weeks anyway, but they, you know, the residents of his district do have a recall as a tool that they can use, but it really rests on his constituents to decide.
When you talk about the business of the city, of course, crime and safety is a big one. We move now to the topic of justice. And this election season, we've heard time and time again how many Angelenos are very justifiably concerned about crime and safety in their neighborhood, in their community. When you consider the policies and the strategies that you would adopt to curb crime, I'm curious, what do you take into account in terms of perspective? And I speak here not only about the perspective of the victim, but also about the perspective of the perpetrator, the person committing the crime. And how does that inform your sense of justice?
Well, you know, I have worked for many years on criminal justice reform. As a matter of fact, in 1990, when I went to the epicenter of the violence and the crime, it was because I believed that we needed to have a comprehensive response. And at the time, we had a terrible problem with addiction. And unfortunately, instead of fighting for treatment, policymakers just passed sentencing laws. So I think that some of the enforcement policies and sentencing policies that sound good actually can contribute to crime long term, because what happens is that people do get out of prison. And if you block them out of the legal economy, they are going to survive by any means necessary. So I have focused on, while I believe in holding people accountable and holding them accountable to the full extent of the law, I also believe that there's a lot of proven strategies to prevent crime. And I have invested a lot of time and resources in terms of policy and funding into crime prevention strategies, some of which I pioneered in the early 90s, but now they've been refined and replicated. And I want to double and triple down on that if I am elected mayor. I also want to open up an Office of Community Safety that is not focused on law enforcement, but is actually focused on other ways that communities need and want to feel safe. But there are parts of town that need serious investment, and we know what those investments should be. That's what I want to do.
And I just want to push a little bit. If you think
Sure.
about an individual who commits a crime, whatever that crime might be, and the person, your house was robbed. I mean,
Yes, it
you know
was.
the perspective of a victim. What do you bring to that? What do you think about when you put yourself in the mental state of someone who has committed a crime or experienced a crime?
Oh, and first of all, that was not the only time I experienced a crime, but
Sure.
that was the latest. You know, I mean, like anybody, I certainly want the individuals that broke into my home to be held accountable. I do. But do I think they should receive life sentences? No. I think they should be held accountable in an appropriate manner. I do think, though, from the perspective of the person who is the perpetrator, that person probably has a family, probably has kids, and I'm very concerned about the statistic that says that if your parent was incarcerated, you have a 50% chance of being incarcerated yourself. So while we want to hold the individual accountable, we don't want to have the unintended consequences to the family or to the neighborhood.
When it comes to those who are tasked with law enforcement nationwide, we've seen what a difficult time police departments are having recruiting, and that is certainly the case here in Los Angeles.
Yes.
In 2020, the LAPD hired 79 police officers instead of the 500 that they normally would add.
79.
Why do you think so few people are interested in policing the city? And if you are elected, what would you do to try and attract more people to the career of law enforcement?
Well, I would spend a lot of effort trying to recruit people, but I think that we have to make sure that people that would come into the profession understand that we are creating a new atmosphere, a new culture. And I think as that new culture and atmosphere is created, I think that people will be more inclined to be officers. I'm very concerned about that. I'm also concerned about the demographics. You know, for example, there's a large number of African American officers that are reaching retirement age and very few following. And so we have to make sure that our officers reflect the demographics of the city. I was involved in police reform on a national level. I headed up the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act. And that legislation provided a lot of resources to upgrade policing. It's interesting that in our country we have 18,000 police departments and no national standards, no standards of accreditation. And so I think upgrading the profession would also attract more people to it.
We are going to pivot now and talk about the number one issue for so many voters.
Homelessness.
You knew it. But we want to do something different here tonight, truly, because we've heard both you and your opponent talk a lot about specific policies. And right now, we really do want to take the time talking about the deeper human values that are involved in this crisis from all perspectives. What we'd like to ask you is, when you come across an unhoused resident of this city, maybe you are in a parking lot and someone is asking you for change, maybe you're driving past the encampments that we find throughout Los Angeles now, and you really take a moment to look at them and assess their situation, what goes through your mind in terms of how that person got there? How do you feel about them as an unhoused resident? And what would you do as mayor to get them helped?
Well, I have to tell you that it breaks my heart, especially because I've been watching this for many years. I worked at LA County's emergency room. My patients were unhoused then. In 1993, when I was running Community Coalition in South LA, we were trying to take over motels. Why? Because we had 54 motels in South Central and no tourists. So you know what was happening in the motels. We thought we could settle two problems with doing that. Number one, we could reduce crime, and number two, we could house people. The fact that it has exploded the way it has, that is the reason why I decided not to run for Congress again. So it breaks my heart. When I encounter people who are unhoused, I give money, I stop, I talk to people. I've walked the streets of Skid Row. I've talked to people inside of the tents, asked what their circumstances were. A couple of weeks ago, I was at Hilda Solis's village that she has, and I was meeting with the woman there, and she lost her housing because she had cancer. So that she lost her job and then spiraled down. And so there are a lot of different reasons why people lose their housing. And one of the things that I try to do is to, when I talk to people, is for them to understand that not everybody is on meth and choosing to be out there, but there's a lot of category. There's thousands of children that are unhoused. They might be with a mother who was fleeing domestic violence, or they might be a former foster youth who was cut off when they were 18 or 21. These are the policy issues I've worked on for many, many years. Child welfare, trying to prevent children from becoming homeless so that they have resources, just like our children do. We don't cut our children off when they're 18. We send them into transitional housing. It's called college. That's what we do. And so why would you expect an 18-year-old without a family to be able to survive? So I think it's so important that people understand the human side of how people wind up there. And I do understand that people are like sick of it and they want to see it go away. But if we go after short-term solutions, like we're just going to round people up, and if they're not cooperative, we will arrest them, it might move them off of your block for a minute. But if they go to jail, they're going to be in jail for 2 days, and they'll be right out. So I feel like the crisis has reached such proportion that we now have to solve the problem. And we do actually know what to do. And one thing that I think is not talked about very often is that we have incredible people in this city who run organizations, who know how to get people off the street and get them housed. They're just never given the resources to reach the scale that they need to solve the problem.
As you well know, Governor Gavin Newsom has been advocating for a plan statewide, yes, that would potentially compel thousands, not all of the people who are unhoused, but folks who are struggling with mental health issues and struggling with addiction into treatment. And I would like you to talk a little bit more about how does that align with your values, saying to someone, this is what you must do, especially if you're talking about individuals who may, for whatever reason, not be ready to accept help in that moment.
Well, it completely aligns with my values, because I think that it is inhumane to allow people to die on the streets. And let me take one issue, addiction. Again, back to the organization that I started, it was about substance abuse. And my staff in the beginning years were all people in recovery. And one of the things that I learned from people who were in recovery, had been in their addiction, or people who had been involved in crime, when they turn their lives around, they become zealots. I mean, they want to spend every hour of the day because they know that they caused harm to themselves, to their families, and to their communities, and they want to go out and prevent that from happening to other people. And so one thing that I want to do is employ people who were formerly unhoused, because I've never experienced homelessness. I can't, have that conversation in that manner, but somebody who has experienced it can help get someone off the street. And it's the same thing with addiction. And so I think that there are ways that we can go about it, and that's how I would approach it.
Thank you for those answers. We turn now to questions from our audience, beginning with a question from the ADL.
Hello, I'm Shirley Darvish-Tabibian. Representative Bass, anti-Semitism has recently emerged from both sides of the aisle in the form of anti-Israel sentiment, disinformation, and bigoted conspiracy theories. How do you address anti-Israel and anti-Semitic bias in your own political networks?
Well, we have to all the time, actually. And I think one of the things that is important is that when you encounter racism, anti-Semitism, bigotry of any level, you call it out. And I mean, that's one of the things that, was revealed in the tapes. And some people are saying, well, I was wrong because I didn't call it out. I think that we have a responsibility 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. My values are a part of who I am always, not 9 to 5, not when I'm in public, not when I'm on camera. It is fundamentally who I am.
And our next question comes from the Jewish Federation.
Albert Prof. Representative Bass, the Jewish Federation recently launched the Study of Jewish LA, the first comprehensive demographic study of our community in 3 decades. One of the key findings of that study was that the pandemic intensified the financial struggle of those who were already experiencing financial hardship. As mayor, what are your plans to help those who live below the poverty line, including 19% of Jewish households who describe themselves as barely making ends meet?
Absolutely. I worked a lot with Jewish Family Services when I was in the State House, and we were going through the Great Recession and had to cut $40 billion out of the state budget. But we did it in a way that we retained the basics of the safety net, and I think that's critical. One of the problems that we have in our city is the finger pointing between the city and the county. And so a lot of times people will say, well, that's the county's job to do that. I don't believe that's the case. I know that the city can provide resources and services as well, and I don't think that we take advantage of our legislative delegations, and we could do that, and we could have them or ask them to put in collective earmarks so that when we do have shortfalls, that we're able to make sure that our community organizations that provide that safety net can survive.
And our next question is from the AJC.
Bob Horning, good to see you.
Good to see you.
Thank you. The city has established new entities such as the Department of Civil and Human Rights.
Yes.
What is your plan to leverage not only this department, but to create new initiatives to engage in intergroup and interfaith work?
Thank you. I have a lot of plans for that, I want you to know. You know, in addition to that, there's the Office of Racial Equity and Social Justice. There's the Office of Immigrant Affairs. And as I mentioned earlier, after the tapes came out, you know, I convened a group of civic leaders, and Representative Jimmy Gomez and I asked them to take on several of these issues. One of the things we asked them to look at are those offices, because I think that those offices could be beefed up. I think they could be much more robust in terms of resources, but also, most importantly, in terms of systematic outreach. Because a lot of times, you know, you're doing all of this work in City Hall, but if nobody knows about it, then it doesn't have the impact that it should. So I plan to be very active looking at all of that and seeing how we can expand it.
Well, you've done so well with your time that we were able to get to our bonus question from the ADL. Whipped right through.
Nurit Robin. Representative Bass, how would you build an inclusive team, and how would you hold people in your administration accountable for their actions? How would you respond to misconduct or corruption within your administration?
Thank you for that question. So I am fortunate that an individual who I think has an outstanding record, Norm Eisen, he served as President Obama's ethics czar, and the Obama administration was one of the most scandal-free administrations in our lifetime. And when I announced that I was going to run, he called me up and he offered, he's an Angelino, but he's in DC, he offered to come here and to stay here for a while and do a top-to-bottom review of everything in terms of ethics, in terms of setting up procedures, so that, number one, people will be very clear on what the rules are, and they will also be very clear on what the consequences are. I think it is about transparency, and it is about accountability. It starts at the top, and I'm deeply worried about it, because if people have no faith in the institution, then how are we going to deal with the problems that we're talking about? When you asked me about interfaith, I believe that to address a problem like 50,000 people who are unhoused, we really have to raise it as a moral issue, because everyone in the city has to realize we have to make room for the people that we need, the housing that we need. And so in the course of the campaign, I've been talking to faith leaders saying, if I win, I'm coming back to you, because we need to have an interfaith alliance that talks about the humanity and that opens people up. Because right now, people want to see the tents go away, but build housing on my block? No, 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 build it someplace else. What that would amount to, if that were to happen, is that all of the affordable housing and housing for homelessness would be in lower income areas that frankly are overcrowded with people living 2 and 3 families in a unit now, and inner city low income communities cannot absorb 40,000 people, and we can't hide them. So, you know, we have to look at it, and so I see bringing the city together as a way to do that. But on the ethics side, it's issue number one. It really is, because how are we going to build these alliances if people basically think that everybody in office is corrupt? So I want to send a very strong message immediately. And I'll tell you, when he comes and does this review, I would make it public. I would make it public, number one, what he found, but two, how we're going to deal with accountability and transparency. And I think that that will go a long way. One thing I've done as a member of Congress is, well, prior to COVID, I always had in-person town halls, but I also did telephone town halls. So I spend a lot of time reaching out consistently to constituents, and every time something happened in DC, some major initiative, I would do a telephone town hall, call 100,000 people, maybe 10,000 would jump on the phone with me, because unfortunately a lot of news is not that newsworthy, except for Spectrum. And I want them to hear from the horse's mouth what is going on in DC.
We're lucky to have a few more moments with you before we move to our closing statement. So I'd like to ask some follow-ups to the questions that we just heard. When you just spoke about meeting with these interfaith agencies and saying, okay, you got to stick with it. If you say we've got to put our unhoused residents somewhere, and as you know, people are reluctant to have it in their communities, sometimes for very justifiable reasons, health concerns. Well, make the pitch, make the argument about how you would bring acceptance.
Okay, well, so let me just say what I did. Right after HHH passed, in my district, and I go all the way to the border of Santa Monica, so I represent Citrus City, Cheviot Hills, Beverlywood, all those areas, as well as South Central. So I went to the areas that I thought, that expressed the concern about people moving in. And I recruited a number of residents, and we started essentially a study area. I brought in scholars. I took people to the Hall of Administration so that they could understand homelessness. They could understand who the population is, and they could see that people can overcome this. And so the reason I did that, and this was several years ago, the reason I did that was because when housing was going to come to their area, I was hoping that we would have a group of constituents who would be strong enough to say, wait a minute, I understand this problem. It's really not what you're saying. The other thing is that there's a lot of neighborhoods who say that and don't realize they already have affordable housing and drug treatment programs in their neighborhood. And we pointed that out too. And it's like, oh, I didn't know that's what that house was. Yeah. And I think that creates a level of acceptance.
And to go back to the discussion that we had about calling out words of hate, I feel that probably everyone watching right now, everyone in this room has been in a position where someone has said something or done something and it doesn't feel right. And we know it is harmful or injurious to a religious group, a racial group, our gender expansive LGBTQ brethren. What is your approach to actually calling it out?
Oh,
It's
sure.
one thing to say you call it out. How do you do that? Because I think we all...
Right, and I have done it many times. So when I started Community Coalition in 1990, the Latino population was a very small part of South Central. We built that organization deliberately as an African-American Latino organization. Because if you're going to do community organizing and you knock on doors, whoever answers is who you want to come to your meetings. And we had numerous examples of where there would be conflicts. And so what we did is that we called it out when it happened, because there would be misunderstandings of Latino residents about African Americans and vice versa. But the other thing we did was we recruited a group of high school students, and we worked with them and taught them the history of African Americans, the history of Latinos, and we raised up a generation. Those young people are now in their 40s. And a number of them are running different organizations, but they were steeped in their history. Similar to me. I mean, when I grew up in the Jewish community, I was steeped in the history of what happened to the Jewish population, as well as in my own history. When you grow up that way and when you're conscious about it, and the reason why I was because of the teachers and the parents in the neighborhood, because the area of the Pico Robinson area has always been an area of a lot of activism. And it was how I was raised, and so I definitely imparted those experiences to a whole nother generation.
And the history is important. The actual words, even with you, if you were informed in all that history, and maybe the other person isn't,
Well,
or if you were, and I'm sorry to interrupt,
Right.
but let's say if you were, for whatever reason, in that conversation, the recording in City Hall, and you heard some of those things said, what would Karen Bass say in that moment to lay bare the hate and the racism that were so clearly in so many of those?
I would call it for what it is and say, do you realize what you're saying? Do you realize the impact of your statement? By the way, when it would happen with neighborhood folks, sometimes they didn't realize that that was a bad word to say. And so you tell people you should not say that because this is what it means to this person. And by the way, this is the history of this word. This is where it goes back to. So maybe in your family that was okay to say, but let me explain what it means when it's said to somebody else.
Congressmember Karen Bass, we have about a minute left with you. We'd like to give you that minute to make any closing remarks you would like to make.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for the opportunity to be here today and to speak with you, and especially to members of the Jewish community. Let me just say that I have devoted my life to fighting for social and economic justice. And part of that fight means always fighting against anti-Semitism and recognizing what is happening right now in our country. And we've been experiencing this for a few years now. And I believe that the only way that we deal with it is by coming together and being very, very aggressive. I have always been fortunate to have wide support in the Jewish community and have over 100 Jewish leaders and organizations that have supported me, that have worked with me for many, many years. And so the Jewish community will always have access to me and my administration if I have the honor of earning your vote. Thank you.
Congressmember Karen Bass, thank you so much for your time this evening during what is a very busy time for you and your team. Thank you for being here with us.
Thank you for having me.
And with that, I will turn it over to Jeffrey Abrams of the ADL.
Thank you very much, Congresswoman Bass. We appreciate you joining us. Good evening. My name is Jeffrey Abrams, and I'm the Regional Director of ADL Los Angeles. While this race was already seen as a highly consequential election for our city, it has taken on even greater importance in recent weeks in light of the leaked city council member tapes and the surge of anti-Semitism. Los Angeles is currently in the midst of a grand reckoning in which all of us have a choice. We can either sit idly by and let hate win, or we can decide to engage in our communities, to make our voices heard, all of us, and vote. We know that anti-Semitism and bigotry of all kinds are on the rise in our city, and now, unfortunately, even in our own city's government. This is an epidemic of a totally new kind, an insidious epidemic of hate. ADL's annual audit of anti-Semitic incidents showed that 2021 was unfortunately a record-setting year. Here in Los Angeles, we witnessed 14 assaults. 14 assaults where Jews were assaulted viciously. In May, diners at a sushi restaurant were assaulted. For those who've seen the video, it's horrifying. We saw 2 Orthodox young boys who were shot with paintballs in their very own driveway. 2021 was a record-setting year here in Southern California, where we saw a dramatic rise in incidents of anti-Semitism, 28%. And when compared to 2017, we've seen over 217% rise in anti-Semitic incidents. And while our city reels from these assaults, we've also seen a surge, hundreds of instances of vandalism and propaganda which have a ripple effect, instilling fear among an entire population of people, something we simply cannot tolerate. Now more than ever, we need thoughtful leadership in our city, the city we all call home. We can and should hold our elected officials to high standards to make sure they respect and are working to improve the lives of all Angelenos. ADL is proud to sponsor this forum along with our partners at the Jewish Federation and AJC for the people of Los Angeles, to give all of you an opportunity to hear from the mayoral candidates and ask how they will tackle the issues that impact our communities, especially those which are most vulnerable, the Jewish community and all who live at the margins. We hope that this forum tonight helps you make an informed choice as to who will lead our great city. As I've said in the past, democracy is not a spectator sport. And now, please welcome back Alex Cohen with our next candidate, Mr. Rick Caruso.
Thank you so much. And as we await Mr. Caruso, I heard him just moments ago with Congressmember Bass there in the hallway, so hopefully we'll have him here on the stage shortly. I will just remind our audience watching live tonight on whatever format you might be watching that our intent here is to really make this as equitable of a conversation as possible. So I will be asking much of the same questions to Mr. Caruso momentarily. It will be a repeat for you all, but it will not be to him. Mr. Caruso, welcome. Please join us.
Thank you. How are you?
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for
Don't
being
get
with
up.
us tonight.
Thank you
We'll
for
let you
having me.
have a seat. We will launch right into it.
Hello, everyone. How are you?
So we will begin. We've got 5 topics this evening, and our first topic is the topic of hate. As we've been hearing throughout the evening, hate crimes against Jewish people have reached a 5-year high here in Southern California last year. And this past weekend, many were horrified to see anti-Semitic banners unfurled over the 405 freeway, Nazi salutes, hateful propaganda showing up on doorsteps throughout the city. Residents of Los Angeles are angry, and residents of Los Angeles are afraid. And in the past, there have been a multitude of anti-hate campaigns that employ all sorts of strategies. If you are elected to lead one of the largest Jewish communities in the world, beyond the words of condemnation, what will you specifically do to use your position to combat this steep rise in anti-Semitism?
Yeah. Well, at the very least, it's very troubling, it's very sad, and it's heartbreaking. It starts with, this mic is moving a little bit, it starts with core values. I think it's more than when I take office. I think the question is, how have you conducted your life? How have you conducted your business? What is your expectation for those around you? When you take a look at my business, and you go onto our website, and you look at our core values as a company, our core values are that we do not tolerate any kind of discrimination against any group. And we specifically talk about anti-Semitism. I am especially concerned about anti-Semitism because the statistic in Los Angeles is incredibly troubling. Hate incidents are up 200% in 2 years. Leadership has to not only take a very strong voice and condemn it, it has to give the resources to prevent it from happening. We have to have more officers on the street that are preventing crimes from happening. We have to have more officers being visible, particularly in the Jewish neighborhoods, in the Orthodox neighborhoods, giving safe passage to worship. We're not doing that now. We're actually leaving it to the communities to fund themselves. We're one of the highest taxed cities in the nation, and we need the resources to protect every community. In addition to the Jewish communities, the AAPI community that has a high incidence of hate crimes. So it's about taking meaningful action. It's about looking at the past, what you've done in your business, what you've done in your life. I'm going to extend that into the mayor's office, and I'll just end with this. Our leadership today, to be very honest, and I'm going to be very honest with everybody and not worry about being politically correct because I'm not a politician, has failed us and the system has broken. And as the system has continued to break and our career politicians have continued to fail to lead, these kind of incidents continue to increase. If you go onto any of my properties, we don't tolerate any of this. We don't tolerate hate speech. We don't tolerate anybody making any cultural background, ethnicity feel uncomfortable. We do just the opposite. We say we welcome you and we celebrate you. And that's the attitude and that's the policies I'm going to bring into the mayor's office.
And be it racial identity, religious affiliation, ethnic identity, gender, sexual identity, I think most Angelenos would condemn hate, and yet we live in a society that is very dedicated to freedom of speech. And could you maybe share with us, providing examples if you can, of places where you walked that line between, on the one hand, attempting to curb hate while simultaneously protecting free speech?
Absolutely. I get to do it every day. It's actually a privilege. My properties are all open to the public. And when you're open to the public, that means you also have to allow free speech. And we do want to allow free speech. I believe in free speech. But you constantly have to make sure that that free speech doesn't cross the line. And when it does cross the line, you stop it. And we do that balance every single day. We do it at the Grove, we do it at the Palisades, we do it at the Americana, right? And we need to do the same thing in the city of Los Angeles. We want people to express their feelings, but you cannot allow it to get into a place that it is hate speech, or even to the point that it creates an incident that causes hate. And I'll give you the example. I think Kanye West, or whatever name he goes by now, what is it? Kanye. I know. I'm not up with the latest and the greatest, but I am up with what he said. And what's as bad, if not worse, of what he said was it gives permission for others to copy. And that's where you have to nip it in the bud and have zero tolerance.
We're going to pivot now to our second topic this evening, which is racism, especially in regards to the recently leaked conversations between several city council members, which has reminded us that despite many of our hopes and aspirations, that this remains in some places a city with deep divisions and racial prejudices. I'm curious, what did that conversation reveal to you about the nature of politics in the city of Los Angeles? And if elected as mayor, what specifically would you do to try and create a new narrative that could truly extinguish racism in all forms?
Well, I'm sad to say that it was shocking. It's not surprising. You know, since I announced running for mayor, I've talked about that our leadership has failed us. And that was a good example where you have three prominent leaders, four, member of the union, but three prominent elected officials that go into a back room. Let's start with that. They go into a back room to divide up the city like it's their private property for their own self-interest. And through that process, make incredibly vile comments that hit almost every ethnicity, every background, every culture in our city. Versus leadership, like I talked about, that welcomes and celebrates the diversity, the strength of the city, the greatness of the city, and it's the greatest city in the country as far as I'm concerned, is the diversity we have. And we need to celebrate that diversity, accept that diversity, promote that diversity, welcome it, right? And that's why I quickly called out for them to resign. And it is beyond fathomable that you have leadership that has still decided not to resign in face of the outcry. And what that tells me is we have a system that, and a culture in City Hall that is more about serving themselves than about serving the public, which is why I believe we've had homelessness getting out of control, crime getting out of control, is because we have a culture of corruption. And when you have a culture of corruption, and I've dealt with this before, it's like a cancer that spreads. And that's what we see.
And when it comes to your own lived experience, your own identity, your own background, could you share with us some specific examples of how that lived experience has shaped your views about racism?
Sure. I've done it many times. My grandparents were immigrants from Italy. My maternal grandparents settled in Chicago, in the old Italian-Polish neighborhood on south end of Chicago. My paternal one settled in Boyle Heights. My grandfather was a gardener. They were as modest and as humble as could be. They didn't know the language. They didn't have any money. But they had this big American dream, and they fought for that American dream. But they taught us as kids, and my parents, they taught us it's about your faith, it's about your family, and about your community. And my parents continued that on. And I remember people making fun of them because of their broken English. That's what they had. My grandfather could never write in English. He never learned that. So I lived that experience. I also lived an experience of a father who was very successful and then had an enormous fall from grace, who was indicted and went to prison, and being teased as a child about my father going to jail. I didn't even know about it when I was young, right? They tried to protect the kids from it, me and my sister and then my brother. It's hurtful. It erodes you inside. Any kind of hatred, any kind of talk like that. So I have lived my life with great compassion for others because of the experiences I've lived through. And that's, frankly, why I'm running for office, is that I feel like this system is so corroded, it needs somebody to change it that has the experience to do such.
We're going to zoom out now and talk about topic number 3, which is representation and governance.
Okay.
And as the city tries to carve some path forward out of what we have seen in recent weeks, there are a lot of questions about how power in Los Angeles should be structured so that all communities are represented equitably. We have a very unique political structure here, and I'm curious what you think may be working well. You talk a lot about a broken system, but is there anything working well, and what changes would you like to see made to LA's current system of governance?
Okay.
Have at it.
Have at it? Okay. I do talk about a broken system. I also talk about what does work well. Listen, I've had the great privilege of working for 3 mayors. Tom Bradley, when I was 26 years old, appointed me to the Department of Water and Power Commission, ultimately became president. Dick Reardon reappointed me during the energy crisis when DWP was threatened of going bankrupt, came back in, served under Dick. And then Jim Hahn asked me to serve as the president of the Police Commission during a very tough time in this city after the Rodney King beating. The general system of Los Angeles, I think, works well. I think we have very well-intended city managers. I think we have very well-intended employees in Los Angeles that work very hard to do the right thing every day. I think our elected officials, not all of them are good, to be very honest, and I've been clear about that. I have also been clear that I believe we need a bigger city council. We have 4 million people in this city that are represented by 15 people plus a mayor. And we should have closer representation to each one of our council members. So I strongly believe in that. We also have a system in Los Angeles that has a separate city attorney's office from the mayor's office and from the city council. Some could argue that's great. I would argue, as a commissioner, being in charge and oversight of 2 very significant departments, DWP and LAPD, that caused an enormous amount of conflicts and complications, because your lawyer, who you need to rely on for advice, isn't necessarily representing you, right? They're representing the general public, quote unquote. And so I can just tell you that through the process of rebuilding DWP, through the process of restructuring LAPD, great complications to it. Somehow we have to find a middle ground on how that works. That's a big change from a charter standpoint. There's a lot of talk that the mayor doesn't have enough authority in the city of Los Angeles. Everybody would always like to have more authority, but the mayor has enough authority to make significant change. The mayor has 50 departments that will report directly to the mayor, that does report directly to the mayor. The mayor nominates and appoints every city commissioner. 3 of those 50 departments are 3 of the largest in the world. Airport, DWP is the largest public utility in the world, and the harbor, one of the largest harbors in the world. An enormous amount of influence, an enormous amount of economic power and economic engines in those departments that have never been used, which could be used to grow the economy of Los Angeles, create more jobs, create more businesses, create more good-paying jobs. So the system itself, I think, works. What hasn't worked is the accountability within the system, and the culture needs to be changed. And what I would change also, without getting too nuanced here, because I've thought a lot about it, you can't have a chief executive officer / mayor having 50 departments reporting up. So we need to change the governance system to make sure that there's accountability, there's goal setting throughout the departments, and they're managed properly, and that disseminates down to everybody in those departments. And so this size of an operation of the city of Los Angeles, an $11 billion budget, the complexities of this city need to have very strong governance, very strong accountability, and it needs to have very strong goals so we know we're making the right progress.
The political nerd in me would love to hear specifics of that plan, but we are trying
I'd love
to
to
get
share with you.
an equal amount of time for
Yeah.
each of our topics. And we also do tonight want to move a little bit away from the specifics and focus on the values and virtues,
Sure.
with which we will turn to our next topic, which is justice. And as you well know, Mr. Caruso, this election season, so many voters are deeply concerned about crime and safety. When you consider the policies that you would want to adopt in response to crime, I'm curious, what do you take into account when it comes to the personal perspective, the impact that it has on victims? And what do you take into account of the personal perspective, the circumstance when it comes to perpetrators of crime? And how would that influence your approach?
Well, I'm the only candidate that's been responsible for a police department, LAPD. I inherited LAPD at a time, like I said, after Rodney King beatings. We had a police department that was under the control of a federal judge, under a federal consent decree, because the department was so broken, it got turned over to the federal courts. We had more officers leaving the department than in the academy coming in. We had crime at an all-time high, spiking. We had the wrong leadership of LAPD. It was a very tough time. So me and my fellow commissioners made the decision, which was not politically popular, not to reappoint the then chief of police because he was not the right leader and was not following the rules of the consent decree. And we had a federal monitor that I dealt with on a daily basis. Went out to hire the best and the brightest. Leadership matters. We brought in Bill Bratton. We built a team around Bill Bratton. But the most important thing we did was institute community policing. Community policing means you have senior lead officers. That's actually an officer, and we still have some, we just don't have enough. Senior lead officers, they're walking the beat. They know the neighbors. They know the business owners. They hand out their cell phone. They create trust. You cannot fight crime. You cannot prevent crime unless you create trust in the community. There will be communities that will never like or love the police. That's fine. That's understandable. You have to respect that. But you have to have communities that will at least trust the police. So you have to have the right reforms. We reformed the department. We hired over 800 officers, and we got crime down to levels not seen since 1950, a 30% drop in crime. And we did it because we went out to the communities and we listened, we heard, we respected the communities, and we allowed zero tolerance of the officers. That's my experience. I want to bring that experience back. It can be done. We've done it before. It just needs the leadership and the knowledge of knowing how to do it and picking the right leaders to head that department to make sure that our communities not only prevent crime, but are safe. And crime prevention programs are incredibly important, after-school programs, gang intervention programs. There's 100 things that we need to do, but it starts with making sure that we have a visible police force to prevent crime and keep our communities safe.
Mr. Caruso, I'm going to do with you what I did earlier this evening with Congressmember Bass, which is push a little bit deeper to move beyond the policies and talk about the personal experience, because much like Karen Bass, you have personally experienced crime. I know, and you've talked about it before, watching as protesters descended upon your properties. Talk to me a little bit about how that feels and how that perspective of being a victim and what you genuinely think is motivating people who commit crimes and how you take that into account as you think about justice.
Well, listen, again, in terms, because I probably didn't fully address how I view the perpetrator. Again, I was raised by a man who I love dearly, that was my best friend, that went to jail and got a second chance and rebuilt his life. And I firmly believe in second chances. I firmly believe in the respect of a human being and the dignity of a human being to rebuild their life. There's no doubt about that. I also firmly believe that all of us deserve to feel safe in our communities, and we don't feel safe today. The experience of watching the damage happen at the Grove was deeply troubling, frankly, based on conversations that were going on as the protest was happening with the mayor at the time and with the chief of police. My biggest concern was not really the Grove as much it was the farmers market. It's an institution in this city, and it's all wood. If a fire would have started at the market, I'm sure everybody's been to the market, right? There's gas meters hanging off the ceilings, right? That thing would have gone up in 3 seconds. And I kept saying, you've got to have people around the market to protect the market. Promises, 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 promises. And yes, it went into the Grove. One of my greatest memories was our head of security going to the LAPD Coban, that station there in front of Nordstrom's, as that was on fire, grabbing the American flag and saving it. The symbolism of that really just made me tear up as I was watching all of this happen. But my disappointment was in the failure of the mayor to manage that protest. It was a peaceful protest starting in Pan Pacific Park, and the decision was made to stop the march at 3rd and Fairfax. They had only gone a block, and that's when it erupted. And that's just wrong. That's lack of experience. It was a mayor that felt that he could give orders to the police because he said, I am directing LAPD at this point. I said, you don't have the knowledge to do that. And it turned out to be a huge disaster. So, yeah, it was a terrible feeling. But great pride, what did my team do? They rallied. We had the Grove reopen, every window replaced. Within 3 days, we didn't charge any of the tenants for any of the repairs we had to do, removed all the graffiti within hours, replaced the Coban so LAPD could come back and be stationed there. And we just have a commitment to keep the community that enjoys the Grove safe, and the community that enjoys the farmers market safe, and respect for the history of our properties, like the market. It's meaningful in Los Angeles.
Before we turn to our audience questions this evening, our final topic this evening is the topic of homelessness. And I think most folks here in this room and watching online have had plenty of opportunities to hear both you and Congressmember Bass talk about your specific, detailed plans. Tonight, what we'd really want you to do is to look at this issue a bit differently. When you come across an unhoused resident, be it on nearby one of your properties, you're driving past an encampment, what goes through your mind when it comes to how that individual got to that place and time? How do you as a fellow Angelino feel about them? And what would you do as mayor to help them find housing?
Well, on the last question, I have a very detailed plan, and I won't spend all the time to go into it. Everybody can review my plans. And they're all based on programs that actually work and are successful. Programs that actually have a 90% success rate, like People's Concern, Downtown Women's Center. You follow as a business person what works, and when something doesn't work, you stop. As a government, we continue to do things that don't work, and that's why the problem grows. In terms of homelessness, I've hired homeless people. I've hired Anthony Henry, who we found out was living in his car and washing in Pan Pacific Park during the morning, brought him in, paid for his education, his full tuition in college. He promoted him up, he earned it, young black man, became an executive, and by the way, got hired away. And Anthony felt very guilty about that. I said, Anthony, this is what should be happening, right? And we've done that multiple times as a company. As a family, my wife and I have worked in Nickerson Gardens, in Jordan Downs, in Skid Row at Para Los Niños for 30 years, quietly. We weren't trying to do it for applause. We were doing it because we believe that we're so blessed we give back. And that was to help people so they didn't fall into homelessness. So they got an education, they got quality health care. If you meet the families that live in Nickerson Gardens, that sleep on the floors because they're worried about bullets coming through the windows, you meet the kids. Tina and I have provided 300 scholarships from 3rd grade all the way through college. So I'm going to take that learned experience, that shared experience. My kids all work there. The other day I was at Watts Empowerment Center. If you haven't been there, you should go and see it. It's incredible the work that they're doing. We have nonprofit organizations just like yours that are doing incredible things that we need to team up with more. And so we can solve the homeless problem. There's a path to do it. There is no doubt in my mind. But it's going to take somebody that knows how to deregulate the building process, deregulate the zoning process, and know how to pull a building permit and actually know how to build, because we don't need to be spending $700,000 a unit of taxpayers' money. It's an absolute waste. I would stop that program, have an audit and accountability, and let's start building very quickly, and my plan does that, to get 30,000 people off the streets. You cannot cure homelessness by providing services on the street. You need to bring them off the street with dignity, compassion, and care. Meet them where they are, build trust, provide psychiatric services, mental health services, drug addiction services, and a lot of retraining. There's a lot of people on the streets that just need a second chance, need a trade, need to finish their education. We should be doing that. We're spending $1 billion a year on homelessness, and it continues to get worse. So, you know, I'm somebody that is solution-oriented, and I want to bring that attitude to the homeless population. It's inhumane, in my opinion, what's been happening in the city of Los Angeles, that 44,000 people are going to sleep on the streets tonight.
And with that, we turn to our first question from the audience from the ADL.
Good evening.
Good
My
evening.
name is Michael Garfinkel.
Hi,
Mr.
Mike.
Caruso, hello. Mr. Caruso, anti-Semitism has recently emerged from both sides of the aisle in the form of anti-Israel sentiment, disinformation, and bigoted conspiracy theories. The question is, how would you address anti-Israel and anti-Semitic bias in your own political network?
Again, I'll go back to, thank you for the question, Michael. I'll go back to what I've done in my business and in my personal life. As an organization, as a family, as a company, we have adopted the IHRA standard. We believe in it strongly. If you go to the website for Caruso, it's very clear what our core values are, which includes the IHRA standard. I think we have to be clear about it as a city. We have to be clear about that the state of Israel is the state of Israel, period, end of story. You could disagree with it, their policies, how it's managed. You could disagree with leadership, like in any great democracy, right? But you acknowledge it. And I think you have to start there and say, we are proud to support the state of Israel. We are proud to support the Jewish people. And let me tell you something, on a very personal level, I wouldn't have the success in my life that I've had without the Jewish community. We built right in the middle of the Jewish community with the Grove. And I started that project by going to the Rabbinical Council and saying, give me your advice. Tell me how to do it the right way. Tell me how to embrace the community. I want them to feel welcome at my property. All the different parts of the Jewish community on the property. That's the same way I would be mayor, is go to the leadership of the communities, get the advice, understand the culture, understand the needs, and then lean into it and actually produce results. I'm sorry about this, Mike. Wow.
And
I think we're going to, yeah.
That's okay. I can just hold it. Why don't I?
Oh,
Do that? Yeah.
yeah,
handheld. Great.
okay.
And our next question comes from the Jewish Federation.
Hi, Cece Filer, Mr. Caruso.
Hi, Cece.
The Jewish Federation recently launched the study of Jewish LA, the first comprehensive demographic study of our community in 3 decades. One of the key findings of the study was that the pandemic intensified the financial struggle of those who were already experiencing financial hardship. As mayor, what are your plans to help those who live below the poverty line, including 19% of Jewish households who describe themselves as barely making ends meet?
Yeah, and that's obviously, you're right with your numbers and consistent with what I've read, is about 20% of the Jewish population identifies itself as on the line, struggling to survive. This goes back again to what Tina and I have done for 30 or 40 years in the communities, is supporting people that are at or below the poverty line. And it's so critically important, as we all know, because the tipping point, the breaking point to become homelessness is so thin, right? And it has to start with health care, education, food. You know, during the pandemic, there was about 9 schools in the South LA, Watts area, East LA, that we were providing food. And it wasn't just delivering food, we were actually providing the transportation to go to the market and as a family shop together to have some sense of joy of getting out of their properties, out of their small apartments, out of their, you know, frankly, Jordan Downs and Nickerson Gardens is not a pleasant place to be living, right? So I think we have to attack that very directly. And we've got a lot of programs, a lot of which you're a part of, that is providing help for that. But we have to be really concerned about our senior community, because I think our senior community, and in the Jewish community very much also, is very much at risk. And it's one of the largest growing populations on the street right now. And that's really sad that we've got seniors living on the street. We should never tolerate that as a city.
And our next question from the AJC.
Hi, I'm Mark Graboff with the AJC.
Hi, Mark.
Mr. Caruso, Rick. I'd like to ask you, the city has established new entities such as the Department of Civil and Human Rights. What is your plan to leverage not only this department, but to create new initiatives to engage in intergroup and interfaith work?
It's a great question. I think that I'm generally against more government, but I'm for more good government that is doing good things. And I think that's a department that's very important, you know, for the city, especially now. If there was ever a time that we need it now. We need to make sure we're giving it the resources, the right budget allocation on it, make sure we have the right staffing, and make sure it's populated by the right thought leaders that are going out in the community and meeting with the leadership that it serves. This is, again, goes back sort of the idea of meeting with the rabbinical council, the senior leaders in the community, whatever community that may be, to really understand it, because no one person can walk in everybody's shoes. I can't fully understand as mayor every need of every community in the city. Nobody can. But I need to surround myself with people that do. And it goes back to a broader question, Mark, that I would just address, even though it wasn't asked, but I think it's part of it. My administration will look like this community. It will look like the Jewish community, the Asian community, the Black community, the Latino community, in the commissions, in the senior leadership, in the department heads, because otherwise you can't fully lead. And I think that's a great opportunity. You have a sign out here that I love. When there's great challenge, there's great opportunity, or something like that. That's the way I view our city right now. We are really challenged, but the opportunity now is endless for change, which is exciting to me.
And I believe we're fortunate enough to have our bonus question once again.
A bonus question, like a bonus
Nurit
round.
Robin.
Hi.
Nurit Robin. Mr. Caruso, how would you build an inclusive team, and how would you hold people in your administration accountable for their actions? How would you respond to misconduct or corruption within your administration?
Well, I addressed it a little bit of having a team that reflects the community to start, but the advantage I have as a chief executive that's started a business with one employee and built it over time into what I believe is a well-recognized company that is very well performing, is you have to have very strict protocols and procedures on how everybody conducts themselves in the office. And then you have to have zero tolerance for misbehavior. I have said this on the debates. Tina and I joke about this. My best friend, this is his line, so I have to attribute it to somebody else, but I never shy from borrowing good lines or good ideas. More is caught than taught. When people see a leader that has integrity and character and values and how they conduct themselves, how they treat people, what their core values are, people follow that. Just the opposite, if people do things that are wrong or bad or corrupt, people follow that too. So it starts with leadership. And putting the right leaders in every position of city government is critically important, holding them accountable. And more people do notice when somebody's been terminated than when somebody's been hired. And at times you have to terminate. And the termination sends a strong message. I will not shy as mayor from terminating people that do not do right, who misbehave, or who do not wake up every morning with the burning desire to serve the public, because that's their job. It's public service.
And Mr. Caruso, before we turn towards your closing statement, as we asked Karen Bass, if you are not successful in your quest to be the next mayor of LA, what do you envision doing next, and would you consider working within the administration of your opponent?
What am I going to do next? I don't know. I'm worried about what I'm going to do on November 9th. We're not going to have a decision because it takes so long to count. And I've been doing like 7 events a day, and I told my wife, my God, we got to go get busy on the 9th after the 8th. You know, I've got a great company. I've turned it over to Corinne Verderay, who's an incredible woman executive, and she's going to go be the CEO. And she's going to continue to run the company and build the business. And so my role in the company is going to be somewhat limited, but that's great. I feel very proud that I have a team that I built, that I could actually step away from the company. How blessed am I, right? Most people can't do that. So I feel very fortunate that I can run for mayor. I'm always going to support Los Angeles. I'm always going to be involved. I'm always going to want to make sure that we've got good governance. And I'm always going to be committed to the causes that we have, like Para Los Niños and Operation Progress, and helping people that are at or below the poverty line. I'm not looking for an official position in an administration at a city, state, or federal level. I can do a lot of great things, I hope, as being a regular citizen, as I've done my whole life. And what was the next part of the question?
It sounds like you would not take an official role, but would you envision yourself in a Karen Bass administration should she be victorious?
You know, I'll make that decision once the election is certified. We'll make that decision on what I do. But again, I'm a bigger believer that everybody in the city, whether you have an official position or not, needs to lean in and help those in this city. We've got people who are in desperate need of help in the city of Los Angeles. And I want to spend my time and my resources where it can make a meaningful difference in people's lives. That's the way I've led my life, and that's the way I want to continue to lead my life.
And we'll give you 1 minute for any departing words you'd like to share with us tonight.
Well, thank you very much. It was great being interviewed by you, so thank you for your courtesy and your time. Thank you, everybody. I love this city. It's as simple as that. A lot of people ask me why I'm running. I'm running because the city has given me everything. Tina and I have been together for 37 years. We've raised 4 children. They all live in Los Angeles. They all live within 10 minutes from our house. I could have never built my business other than in the city of Los Angeles. I get rewarded every day by the residents of Los Angeles that step onto our properties for no other reason than just to be together, to enjoy life, to experience the day or experience the evening. Why wouldn't I want to give back? Why wouldn't I want to help? I've spent 40 years of my life giving back to the city through being a commissioner. I love public service. I think it is a sacred duty, and I feel honored that I have the ability to do it. I know our city is in trouble. I firmly believe that I can help. And the great advantage that I have is that I'm beholden to nobody. And people will criticize that maybe you're spending too much money. That's not the issue, in my opinion. The issue is every day I'm going to be able to wake up, go to the office in City Hall, and say, I'm going to do what's right for the city of Los Angeles and the residents, and not worry about a political career that I don't want. This will be my one and only election. I promise you, my one and only candidacy. I want to serve as mayor, work with everybody here, change the direction of our great city, and then go back home with the reward and the knowledge that I've given back to the city that's given me so much. So I hope to have your support. Thank you very much.
Mr. Caruso, thank you for your time. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Rick Hirschhout of AJC.
Thank you very much, Alex and Mr. Caruso. Thank you very much for being with us this evening. I think it is not an overstatement to say that this evening's candidate forum was the very best of a very long and difficult, particularly in these recent weeks, election season for our city. LA has not looked good to the world in recent weeks. We are a much better community than we have shown. Our true face lies across the diversity of this great city. We are hurting. We are in crisis. We need to begin to heal. That hopefully begins tonight. The election, we know, is consequential. We've seen the candidates go through a very long and at times arduous experience. And for their service, for their entering this arena, both Mr. Caruso and Congresswoman Bass, we owe an enormous debt of gratitude. But we also have a responsibility and an obligation. And I can't help but think of my in-laws of blessed memory, Alex and Violet Satmary, immigrants to this country, Holocaust survivors who rebuilt their lives here in Los Angeles, not far from the Grove and Farmers Market, which was a regular place for them and their friends, fellow survivors, but who took Election Day and the privilege of voting as a sacred obligation. It was something they planned for, they dressed up for, they thought about, and they talked about with their children, my wife Susan and my sister-in-law Shirley, because that was the promise of democracy, the promise of civic participation. And so that, ladies and gentlemen, throughout Los Angeles, that is our sacred obligation. We have a duty to take this most consequential election seriously, because the fate of our city is in the balance. We need to have a better look. We need to have that better look a month from now, and we certainly need to have that better look 6 years from now, when Los Angeles is on a global stage in hosting the Olympic Games. We have a lot of work to do, but this is a place of possibility and opportunity and determination and resilience, and we will get there together. On behalf of our partners this evening, the Jewish Federation of Los Angeles, the Anti-Defamation League, and many, many friends who have joined in co-sponsoring this evening's forum, we thank you. We encourage you to take on this homework assignment, to vote, to do it with energy and with enthusiasm and vigor, and to vote like our democracy and our civic pride and civic health depends upon it, because it does. Thank you, one and all. Thank you, Alex. Thank you, Mr. Caruso. Good night, everyone.
And I will just quote my dear friend and LA County Registrar, Dean Logan, so many days, so many ways. You can vote now. It is not only sacred, it is simple. So please do vote. My sincere thanks to our candidates this evening and to our 3 sponsoring organizations. Good night, everybody.